18. Escape. Ninani eyed the vase of ointment she held in both hands and regretted that it was the only large container that she had. She hadn't even opened it yet, and it was supposed to be a rare and beautiful fragrance imported from the Indus region. Still, she needed it for a purpose more urgent than scenting herself. Freeing her left hand, she eased the door open until she could see through the crack in the frame. There was just the one sentry, and not particularly alert. Her father didn't really expect her to try going anywhere, and the sentry knew he was on an easy assignment, not to be taken seriously. More fool him. Taking a better grip on the neck of the vase, Ninani used her foot quietly to ease the door far enough open for her to slip through. Her bare feet made no sound on the floor, and she tiptoed to within striking distance. As she had feared, the fragile container shattered when she slammed it down on the man's head. He fell, covered in sticky, odorous ointment, amidst the shards of the pottery. Ninani bent to make certain that he was breathing regularly. She had no wish to permanently injure the man, who was simply following orders. With relief, she noted that he was merely unconscious. Her sensitive fingers found swelling and bruising on his scalp, but the bone did not appear damaged. She returned to her room for her sandals, and then quickly ran down the corridor, staying in the shadows. She saw no one at all as she made her way down the stone stairs. There was no guard on the cell door. There was no need for one, since it was impossible to open from within. And who would dare disobey the edicts of the king by releasing the prisoners? Ninani reflected that a few days ago not even she would have dared. But with the menace that was Ishtar growing stronger and more evil day after day, she had no other option. She eased the restraining bar out of its sockets. Quietly, she opened the door. All three of them were within. Enkidu and N'Gula were sleeping, but the doctor was still trying to free himself. He had eased off a shoe and sock, and was trying to remember what Harry Houdini had taught him about compressing his foot to get it through a narrow gap. Seeing the light from the door, he glanced up in surprise. "Princess," he murmured, "is it visiting hour already?" "Quietly," she cautioned him. "I've come to set you free." "Are you sure that's wise?" he asked, watching her pick up the mallet and a wedge of wood. "I don't think your father will be very happy." "My father is generally a very wise man," Ninani answered, "but in this instance he's allowing his fears to outvoice his reason." Dropping to one knee, she placed the wedge she carried underneath the wedge holding shut the stocks. Then, with careful taps, she knocked it free. The noise woke the two sleepers. Their questions were cut off by the doctor hissing for silence. As silently as possible, Ninani knocked out the second of the wedges, allowing Enkidu to haul the top half of the stocks away from his and the doctor's feet. The warrior then took the hammer and wedge from Ninani and set about freeing the priestess. The doctor hopped about on one foot, replacing his shoe and sock. As soon as N'Gula was free, the doctor beckoned everyone to him. "Right," he told them in a low voice. "We have to move quickly. We don't know when somebody might come along to check up on us, so let's make the most of whatever time we have. N'Gula, can you lead us to the Temple of Ishtar by a route that keeps us out of public view?" "Of course, Lord," she agreed. "Follow me." As she led the way out of the dungeon, the others fell in behind her. Enkidu had kept the mallet he had used, since it was the only thing they had that could serve as a weapon in case of trouble. Bringing up the rear, the doctor allowed himself a little indulgence in hope. "I knew I'd think of a way out of this," he congratulated himself. "A little more luck like this, and Ishtar would be finished." Aga sat in his throne drinking new wine from a silver goblet. He had no idea what it tasted like, since his occasional mouthfuls of the liquid were swallowed swiftly. He knew that it was a mistake to drown his fears in strong drink, but since it was the only plan he'd been able to come up with, he was grimly carrying it out. If he was honest with himself, he knew Ninani was quite correct. Ishtar would enslave them all before she was done. But what could he do? Taking another swallow, he reflected that Ishtar was quite capable of killing Ninani if the whim took her, and he couldn't risk that. And besides, there was that magical box of hers that could destroy all of creation should Ishtar be killed. Having looked into her eyes, he knew that this was no idle threat. The whole situation was hopeless. On the whole, he knew that he was a capable and possibly even a good king. But in such extremities as this, the gods mocked him, making him a king of nothing. What could he do? He took another swallow of wine and realised his goblet was empty. Reaching for the pitcher, he poured himself another drink. Slamming the pitcher back onto the table, he saw a slow movement in the shadows. "Who's there?" he growled, glaring at the darkness. "Show yourself like an honest man." Dumuzi moved into the circles thrown by the blazing torches. In the flickering light he looked inhuman. His thin features, his white beard, his heavy nose, and above all those glassy eyes. "Greetings, lord," he murmured. "Taking your ease?" "Nurgle take you, slinker in the shadows," the king replied, his words slurred by wine. "Why do you creep through the darkness?" "Because if I did not, then I would be seen as I spied on you, O king." "So," Aga snarled, "you're keeping an eye on me for Ishtar, eh?" "Fool," the high priest snapped. "I am Ishtar. These eyes are my eyes, this tongue my tongue. I am here just as certainly as I would be if my body were present." "You make my skin crawl," he told the priest, stumbling to his feet. "I believe what you say, Ishtar. I've seen you taking possession of men's bodies before. So why do you have Dumuzi's eyes spying on me?" "I was waiting," was the priest's reply. "I wanted to have you in this sorry, bedraggled state when you came before me. It amuses me to see the king of Kish act like a common drunkard." "Amuses you?" he laughed. "A human emotion, surely. Not one fit for a goddess." Dumuzi's body shrugged. "There may not be much that is human within me," he said for Ishtar, "but my emotions remain. I enjoy laughter, and at times revenge." The smile on Dumuzi's face was like the rictus on the face of a corpse. Now it is time for revenge. Staggering down from the dais, Aga moved towards the old priest. Glaring through an alcoholic haze, he tried to suppress his fears. "Revenge? What are you prattling on about?" "What?" asked Dumuzi in amused tones. "Don't tell me that you have no idea what your dear, beautiful daughter is doing." A cold wave of shock washed over Aga, almost sobering him. "She's in her room, under guard," he replied. "She can be of no interest." "On the contrary," roared Dumuzi, voicing Ishtar's pleasure. "Even now she has freed the 3 prisoners that you took and hid from me. Did you not think I would find out about them, and who they are? Fool! She and they are heading to my temple. Aga, I warned you that if she interfered with me, she would become my slave or my feast. Now you will see how I keep my word." With a curse, Aga threw the dregs of wine into Dumuzi's face. Pushing the old man aside, the king rushed from the throne room. As the wine dripped untouched down his face, Dumuzi watched the king stagger out into the corridor. "Yes," he murmured, satisfied, echoing Ishtar's thoughts. "I thought that would get you moving. Another one on his way to me. I do so love parties. And what a gathering and a feast this one is going to be." And throwing back his head, the old priest laughed inhumanely into the empty room. "I don't like this," Enkidu muttered. Stifling an urge to scream, the doctor said with strained patience, "Well, I appreciate realism. Haven't you ever heard of the power of positive thinking? You've done nothing since our escape but complain about things." "That's because I'm naturally cautious," replied Enkidu. He peered out from behind the pillar that concealed them both. Ahead of them, the main room of the Temple of Ishtar stretched out. "And I tell you, I don't like this. Then I promise we'll speak to the decorators when we're finished, and we'll have them repaint the place for you. The ape man glared at him. I meant that it's too quiet. He may be correct, Lord, Angula interposed before the doctor could say anything. At this hour there are usually about 20 priests here, offering sacrifice. The doctor took another quick look. He could see only 6 or 7 of the robed figures, although about 20 worshippers were bearing animals to the slaughter. Maybe it's the lunch break, he suggested. Everything looks fine to me. He stared at them both in annoyance. Why can't you be like Ninani and stop arguing with all of my decisions? The princess, still looking apprehensive, was watching the rear. She was quite astonished at her own bravery and skill, and feeling pleased that the Lord Ea approved of both what she had done and the attitude she was showing. All right, Enkidu said reluctantly. Then how do we get across the temple without being seen? Must I think of everything? The doctor glanced round the pillar again. The only other people in sight were the priestesses, sitting or moving about in their alcoves. From time to time, one of the male worshippers would cross to one of them and throw down an offering coin. The priestess would then lead him to one of the side rooms to commune with the gods. Angula, I think it's time you rejoined the priesthood. She looked blankly at him, so he explained. The rooms we want are behind the altar. The rooms the temple priestesses use are between here and there. We can make the extra little hop, skip and jump before we're spotted. Angula grinned, catching on. With a nod, she quickly rearranged her costume to expose her breasts, thus marking herself as one of the temple staff. The doctor, meanwhile, managed to use his umbrella to snag and draw to him 2 of the cloaks from the table where the visitors placed them while they were in the temple courts. He handed one to Enkidu and struggled into the other himself. Ninani regarded him, a firm look in her eye. I am not going to bear myself for this masquerade, she told him. It would not be seemly for a princess to display herself in such a fashion. Don't let the fact that it might save all our lives influence you, the doctor thought. Aloud, he simply said, Well, let's hope that Angula's efforts are enough. Enkidu, you escort her to the communing chambers, then slip into the inner sanctum. I'll be right behind you with Ninani. The Neanderthal soldier nodded. Throwing his cloak about the princess as well as himself, the doctor suggested, At least try and pretend you're about to offer me heavenly bliss. Every inch of the journey was torture for them. Angula managed more than passably to act as if she was back at her old job, teasing and enticing a client to the back rooms. Ninani tried her best to emulate her companion, but to the doctor's apprehensive ears, it sounded as convincing as an amateur vocalist working on Wagner's Ring without either a score or an ear for music. Still, no one in the temple spared the group a second glance, so he could only assume that their little act was either completely convincing or utterly boring. Passing by the entrance to the boudoirs, they slipped into the back rooms behind the altar. The doctor took one last look over his shoulder and then let out a sigh of relief. He hadn't been certain that they could make it unchallenged. Throwing his cloak aside, he peered into the gloom. Power failure, he asked. It had been dark like this the last time he had been in here. Angula shrugged. Ishtar likes the gloom. I wonder if it means she can't stand the light, or that she's got exceptional eyesight and likes her visitors at a disadvantage. Either way, Enkidu hissed, we are in the worst position whilst it remains dark. It's difficult to see much, which restricts our ability to fight. Or spy. Well, standing here talking all day won't help matters much, the doctor answered. I can see perfectly well, so follow my lead. Without waiting to ascertain that they had agreed, he led the way through the room to the inner door. Thankfully, his eyes were much more sensitive than those of his human companions. If Ishtar made a few more miscalculations like that, he'd be happy. These rooms were clearly where Ishtar did most of her public work. The stench of ether was much stronger here. He could see several jars by one wall, all carefully sealed, obviously her stockpile of knockout drops. The room was ornately laid out, and he spotted, with a wry grin, 2 small alcoves in the wall, one on either side of the doorway. A priestess in each of those, and anyone coming through the door would be grabbed, forced to their knees, and drugged if the need should arise. That was how they had surprised him on his previous visit. So why was the room empty? Maybe Ishtar had a pressing engagement somewhere else. Gesturing for the others to stand still, the doctor crept to the far doorway. He realised belatedly that the other 3 hadn't been able to see his gesture in the darkness and were still right behind him. "Stay here a minute," he hissed. When he was certain that they would, he stepped through the door and into Ishtar's inner sanctum. This room was brighter, simply because of all the machinery in operation. 2 walls were filled with computers, both with programs running continuously. Monitoring equipment filled the rest of the space. There was only one gap in the machinery. Some sort of recharging chamber, he assumed. If Ishtar was, as he suspected, a cybernetic organism, then this was where she plugged herself in for a battery charge. Time to work that out later. At the end of the room was a throne of sorts, and directly in front of it a small square box. He hurried over and examined it through his glasses. He whistled softly to himself. Cobalt bomb, and wired into brain patterns by the look of things. He pursed his lips. Could make turning her off a bit dangerous. So she wasn't lying to King Aga about being able to wipe Mesopotamia off the face of the earth. Ignoring this complication for the moment, he moved to examine the computers. They were not of a familiar pattern, but he estimated that he could get the hang of them quickly enough. A bit of reprogramming might do them all the world of good. Ishtar clearly used a built-in radio somewhere in this lot to stay in communication with the mind she had touched. If that was ever linked to the immense circuit she had designed for the walls of Kish, her signal might be able to fill the known world of this period. And with the right power source, and enough of the implanted electrodes, she could probably rule the Earth. A frightening thought, since she would change the whole course of human history and evolution. The doctor doubted it would be for the better, given what he had been told about her so far. If she felt the need to implant mind-controlling devices in people's heads, it suggested that she had both an incredible disregard for individual personalities and also an overwhelming urge to control others. Neither trait was admirable. Time for a little subtle sabotage, Doctor, he told himself. First of all, a monitor. He walked over to the screens on the next wall. Tapping thoughtfully on the buttons below one of them, he started to reroute the command paths of the computer to show on the screen. Without his touching the controls, though, the screen sprang to life. He found himself looking at the back of his own head. Slowly he turned round as his image on the screen repeated his actions. In the doorway to the room, watching him with gleaming red eyes, was Ishtar. Slinking forward slightly, she purred, "Doctor, so nice to meet you at last."